Today on Militaria at the museum, we're going to check out a unique style of weapon that combines a short sword with a flintlock pistol and was originally used by wealthy hunters of the time. After that, we'll look at a collection of Canadian Navy uniforms and discuss how the dress code has evolved. Lastly, we'll learn of an interesting report that documents the crashes of 16 different Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft and try to uncover why a former lieutenant assembled it. Beyond museum exhibits lies a hidden realm of archived artifacts that hold the keys to unlocking intriguing stories from the past. Come along as I meet with experts at the Army, Naval, and Aviation museums, where I've been granted special access to pull back the curtains and reveal the secrets of their militaria. My name is Sandy Hiltz, and all my life I've been captivated by military history. Now, I have the rare opportunity to explore a collection of fascinating military artifacts on Militaria at the museum. The Army Museum has an example of a pistol sword, which combines two weapons into one. Kevin Robbins is going to tell me about the hunting origins of the weapon and how it came to limited use in military service. Due to their shortcomings, pistol swords quickly fell out of favor. Still, they are an interesting weapon, well worth a closer look. So Kevin, I understand you have a great example of a combination weapon to show me.
A hunting sword with a flintlock pistol attached to it.
I've heard of things like this, but I've never gotten to see one in person.
They're pretty rare this side of the water.
Kevin, thank you for pulling this out of the archives for me to take a look at today. I'm quite excited because I've certainly heard of pistol swords, but I've never actually had the opportunity to see one in person, and this looks like a really beautiful example. What can you tell me about it?
This is a hunting sword or a hunting hanger in terms of its length. The addition of a fire lock or a pistol onto a sword like this goes back to the early 18th century in regard to their usage. Combination weapons, though, kind of have been around for a while prior to this. But this is, again, a very specific type of combination weapon, the hunting hanger with pistol attached. In regard to this is a classic sort of hanger form in that we have the stag handle, okay, from a deer, set of deer antlers. Again, from the 18th century, a great example of what they call a shell guard here. The very nice 18th century 3/4 inch blade or a 32.5 inch blade, a nice deep fuller here, and again, a swan neck here on the fire lock in terms of the cock or the hammer here. And again, a nice simple guard. So this is, just a very high quality gentleman's companion piece, if you would.
So when would this example date to, Kevin?
Well, when you look at the hardware, again, the shell guard, the stag head, the swan neck, the deep fuller, these things, and again, the classic size, and this very simple guard, I put this somewhere between 1760, 1780s.
Where would this particular example have been manufactured?
This one, given the styling, I think it's probably made in Germany.
Right.
And exported to England.
And so how did this come to be at the museum, this example?
Well, again, we get an enormous amount of sort of donations, especially in the early days. So when the museum opened in 1953 and the run-up to that, you have all the old families of Halifax, who many of them had connections directly to the military from World War I, World War II. With that, they were very generous in helping to start a new museum about the military history of the city. And these swords, of course, not necessarily this one, but these small hunting swords are very popular in the time of the 7 Years' War and the time of the American Revolution with British and then later with American officers. And again, it's a kind of a high-end sword in that regard, or a hanger, in that it has a flintlock pistol attached to it. Again, other examples we have in the museum's collection are date from the 17th century, well into the 18th century, but that is an exceptional piece in regard to the placement of that flintlock pistol.
Kevin, what would the process for loading this be like?
This is a muzzle loading flintlock firearm. Even though it's mounted on a sword, this would be mounted the same way, say, as a dueling pistol, a set of pocket pistols. You'd first put the powder in, put in a ball, put in a little wadding to keep it in place, okay? And then again, what's left over, you would turn the sword over, and in the pan, right here by the barrel, like all flintlocks, there is a vent hole. So you put a little priming powder here, pull back the swan neck cock to safety, to a half cock, close the frizzen, put that forward, and then with the flint, when you pull the trigger like any other flintlock, the hammer comes forward with the flint, it strikes the frizzen drops over, spark drops into the pan, and discharges the weapon.
Kevin, when would the pistol sword sort of start to be phased out of usage?
You don't see too many of these, this configuration like this, past sort of like the early 1800s.
Right.
Okay, and again, let's advancement in hunting rifles and just the general sort of access of better tools, so to speak, for hunting. So hunting hangers don't completely disappear.
And throughout their lifetime, this is never something that's really adopted as a primary weapon, is it? It's always sort of to finish something off, really.
Yeah, with the pistol. But again,
Right.
like as a status symbol, okay?
Right.
Depending, again, like say, there's a great example, I think it's in Berlin, of a hunting sword that's, almost literally just like an ornament
Right.
for Kaiser Wilhelm.
Right.
Okay. And again, these have a lot to do with, again, if you're hunting boar, and if you're hunting boar with spears, a boar spear, this is like a pretty intense pastime.
Right. And is this something that's quite rare to have in a collection? You don't see a whole lot of them, that's for sure.
No, again, it all depends on like families. They hold on to things. How do things come to the museum? How do things become artifacts, part of collections? But we have, 4 other examples of hunting hangers.
Right.
All of them that are earlier and don't have this. This is quite rare. Again, people bring things with them. People, again, when they're at war, people will bring things home,
Sure.
either through purchase or sometimes through acquisition of finding something in a house, right? So I've seen different examples of that over the years. Something
Right.
that somebody picked up and brought home, right?
Kevin, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to see this today. I'm certainly familiar with pistol swords, but it's been really exciting to be able to see and handle one in person.
Well, it's great that you enjoyed it, and thanks for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.
In Europe, these things are much more common, hunting swords or hangers. So again, it's not very common to see one of those over here. And if you look at the sort of import stamp that's on that was brought over from Europe in someone's private collection. So not all that common on this side of the Atlantic, even in the heyday of hunting hangers.
After the commercial break, I'll get a full rundown of the uniforms used by the Canadian Navy and all of the changes they've gone through over the years. Here at the Naval Museum, they have a whole room dedicated to the history of naval uniforms. While it may be surprising to some, the iconic black uniforms of today haven't always been the standard. I'm meeting with curator Jennifer Gamble to discuss each version of the official uniform and what alterations were made throughout its evolution. Jen, I know the museum has quite an extensive collection of Royal Canadian Navy uniforms, but I want to go back and talk about the original introduction of uniforms to the Navy.
So back in 1749, the Royal Navy introduced a standard uniform for their officers. It was very important for the British to distinguish between their officers and gentlemen class and the ordinary sailor.
Jen, we are all likely familiar with the redcoats of the British Army. What was it that led to the Navy having the color blue?
Well, naturally, the Navy wanted to have some distinctions separate from the Army, but famously, it was actually King George II. He was riding through a park in London one day, came across the Duchess of Bedford wearing this striking navy blue, and he said, "Oh wow, look at that. that looks spiffy. And so he decided that blue would definitely be the official color of the Royal Navy.
Really?
In the mid-18th century, it was very important for the Royal Navy to have a distinction from the regular army, which were the redcoats. And this was primarily due to the fact of the victories that were happening around the Napoleonic Wars. After Trafalgar, British society knew about the Royal Navy, had distinction around the Royal Navy. So it was very important that the Royal Navy started to have more of their own uniform and own standard system.
With most of our naval and other military traditions coming from the British, I should imagine that they had a large influence on our uniforms as well, did they, Jen?
Absolutely. Just like most Commonwealth nations, our naval uniforms, Army uniforms, and Air Force uniforms are based off that British standard uniform. And naturally, when Canada became its own country, we adopted a lot of that same tradition in the way we design the uniforms and also operated as an armed forces. In fact, I could probably show you, if you'd like, some of the examples of those early uniforms and how they started to change in our exhibit called Dressing with Purpose.
So this is where it all began.
Yes, so when Canada first became a nation, naturally we kept that Royal Navy uniform. This is our oldest uniform in the collection. As you can see, it has the standard blue collar and the typical white tunic that you would see that a lot of the ordinary sailors would wear at the time. So during the First World War, we maintained that very Royal Navy uniform because we were still a very small navy at that time. But then when the Second World War broke out, this is when you really start to see Canada come into their own from a naval perspective. And so the Canadians who served in the Royal Canadian Navy wanted to be identified as Canadian. It was so important that that identity was made because even to this day, when we talk about the history of the war, especially the Battle of the Atlantic, Canadians are not mentioned as often as they should have been. And so sailors and officers knew this at the time. They would go into foreign ports and they'd be like, "Oh, you're British." And they'd be like, "No, Canadian." And so it was during the early war years that we started to see sailors and officers wear flashes that said Canada and other things that made them Canadian, and it wasn't legal to do so.
Really?
And it wasn't until about 1942-43 that they standardized Canadian flashes and other rank distinctions that made them Canadian. Just like the women in the Royal Navy, the women of the Royal Canadian Naval Service adopted the similar blue uniform that the women were wearing for the Royal Navy. So in 1942, when the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service was established, this was a typical summer uniform for an officer of the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service. So by the time the Second World War ended, we had a lot of distinctions on the uniform that were Canadian. The buttons had changed to say Canada on them.
Right.
They were wearing the Canada flashes. And then, of course, when we moved into the Korean War, you started to see on the arms of the trade badges, it went from a crown to a Canadian flag. Into the Korean War and up into the early 1960s, the uniform was still that standard blue with the blue collar. So here's a wonderful example of the gold buttons, and then of course the new trade badges, which include the Canadian maple leaf. And then as you move down here, this is kind of an example of the different trades that established. So Canada started to establish their own trades and distinction of those trades. And then of course, we have wonderful examples in our collection of, this is a mariner's uniform with that Canadian badge on it. And then down here, we have the standard tropical uniform with, again, the Canadian flashes and badges on it.
So 1968, Jen, when the forces are unified into one, it goes a long way beyond the uniforms, does it not?
Absolutely. When you see that change in uniform, it was kind of a political and economic endeavor. The idea was, by unifying the forces, you brought Canada's military together into a single identity, which in their mind, they thought would make it more Canadian.
Now, Jen, when the decisions were being made in the 1960s regarding unification, the Navy certainly didn't take this sitting down, did they?
They did not. So there was a lot of vocal recognition against unification. When the White Papers of Defense was published in '64, immediately Rear Admiral Landy Moore was very vocal about how it was a bad decision. The Navy deserves to hold on to its identity. It has worked hard to gain that identity and that distinction. And so he was avidly against unification. So unfortunately, when Bill C-243 had passed in Parliament and unification was introduced, Landy Moore was asked and did retire from the Royal Canadian Navy. Beside this unification uniform, you see that we went back to not a traditional navy blue, which is very British, but more of a black color,
Right.
which again was another way of creating a distinction between us and the British. As you see, we lost the famous executive curl that was
Right.
that distinguished the rank. In 2010, they reintroduced the executive curl for the anniversary of the Royal Canadian Navy. So our uniforms actually now have that curl again, but we had lost it during unification. So these early uniforms from 85 to about 2010 didn't have the curl, but they had the new standard black, the reintroduction of the gold buttons, and of course the Canadian ranks returned to the Royal Canadian Navy.
Right. Jen, thank you for looking through the evolution of the naval uniform with me today. It's been great to see our evolution out of our Royal Navy roots and into a place where we now, post-1985, seem to have come into our own, balancing our history as well as our own national identity as Canadians.
Absolutely, I'm so glad I got to share it with you today.
Thank you.
So our current modern Navy uniform is a blend and evolution of what our uniforms used to be to what they are now today, which is a flair of modern modifications and materials and styles, but also a throwback to old tradition rank styles and adornments.
Next, I'll turn my attention to a certain Hawker Hurricane that the museum pulled out of a lake with the help of the Coast Guard and their helicopter. President Mark People of the Aviation Museum is going to show me some parts and photos from the Hawker Hurricane that the museum pulled out of Pine Lake in the 1980s. What makes this crash especially interesting is that the details of it are documented, for reasons unknown, in a report called the Accident Proneness Report. Mark, I know about the Accident Proneness Report, but I hear you have an actual tangible link to one of the crashes.
We do. We actually have a piece of a Hawker Hurricane that crashed in 1943, and this crash was included in this report that outlined crashes across Canada with the RCAF, and it varied from various different aircraft, from Canso flying boats to aircraft like the Hurricane, which crashed in our backyard. But we actually have a piece of that Hurricane in our collection.
Oh, look at all this stuff, Mark.
Yeah, it's the Aladdin's Cave here.
So where's the piece of the Hurricane?
I think it's actually just right here. Here it is.
So this is the piece.
This is the piece. Let's take it out and I'll just get you to gingerly look at it, but you'll see that it's quite heavy. But what that is actually a joint for the tubing between the frames. So there's actually this piece here, and you can see this is stainless steel, and then there's these rivets that are riveting the whole tube. Now, of course, the tubes aren't connected anymore, but that was part of that. Obviously, because the aircraft crashed, and then it sat beside a lake for 30 plus years before it was even found.
So how did this actually make its way to the museum, Mark?
Well, in the mid-'80s, a group from the museum in the early days of the museum actually went out and recovered the aircraft remains from the lake, which is a lake called Pine Lake, which is just east of Dartmouth.
And this is actually one of the ones that's mentioned in the proneness report?
Right, and this is what's interesting, because the proneness report was done post-war. It laid dormant for years until a researcher found the report and then started asking questions. Why was all this thing? And she actually wrote a book about this.
And do you have a copy of that book we could take a look at?
Yeah, we do. Why don't we take a look at that as well, and then you can get a real true picture of what we've got here.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to see that.
The proneness report is an interesting document that was created by a RCAF flight lieutenant in 1948. And what he requested were the reports for a number of crashes that happened across Canada and Alaska during the Second World War. The pilots were all involved and crew were killed, and all the aircraft types were very much different types. They ranged from Hurricanes, P-40s, Mosquitoes, Canso flying boats. There was no real general trend to it.
Mark, I understand there's a bit of an anomaly to the proneness report.
Well, there is, because there's never been any indication why the report was done in the first place and what really use it was.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, so the neatest thing is that I saw the report and then I saw the story about this particular hurricane that we actually had a piece of.
Yeah, it's quite something that it came in that order, that you didn't go searching for the plane because of the report.
No, I mean, and ironically, it was a number of years later. Obviously, we pulled the wreck up in the mid-'80s. This is now, 2023, so it's a fair long distance between that crash and understanding exactly the story about the pilot and exactly what happened.
It certainly is.
The Hawker Hurricane was designed to enable it to be repaired efficiently. It was a tubular frame construction covered with fabric on the fuselage. They carried 303 Browning machine guns in each wing, giving it a very stable gun platform. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, the Hurricane shot down the majority of the enemy aircraft during that battle.
Mark, what can you tell me about the pilot who was flying the Hurricane at the time of the crash?
Well, we've got his complete story in the report, which is now being put into a book form called Clerisy. We can actually see the name in chapter 17, George Randall Wallat. He was born in 1921, so he would have been 22 when he was killed. So again, this shows what sort of age group were actually flying these planes.
And I understand that you actually had a hand in this book, did you?
Yeah, I helped the author, her name is Anne Gaffiuk, and she's based in Calgary, and she had, in her research, stumbled across this proneness report that basically listed all these pilots.
Did you have any of the context of the crash before you found out about the report?
No, we knew the aircraft number, which was the basic part of it, which actually was a Canadian car-built Sea Hurricane that was actually built in Fort William, which is now Thunder Bay.
What do we know about the reasons that Flight Lieutenant Hay may have done this report? Would he have been ordered to do so, or was this some sort of personal undertaking?
Well, J.B. Hay, or he was also known as Hugh Burns Hay, actually was a flight lieutenant in the RCAF. He had some medical training, and there was some thoughts, and again, this is the hypothesis, is that he was trying to figure some sort of thesis about pilot losses during World War II.
Mark, with there having already been this book written about the subject and so much research done, I presume that it's really going to remain a mystery unless there's some sort of grand breakthrough as to why Hay would have prepared this report.
Well, exactly. I mean, the author, Anne Gaffiuk, went to extensive lengths to try to figure this out and didn't do it. But she had enough research and enough of the information that it was certainly worthy of producing the book that we have with us today.
Mark, thank you for sharing this with me today. It's been a pleasure to look through the story and to be able to handle a piece of the aircraft that's involved in this report. I certainly hope that one day there may be some sort of breakthrough as to why Hayes prepared this report, but it doesn't seem overly likely.
No, but one always hopes, but again, even after a number of looking at this report in second light, nothing really stands out. So again, that's now it's a great historical snapshot of pilots that paid the ultimate price. For me, that's something that's even more important.
Absolutely.
The Hawker Hurricanes went on to serve throughout the war in every theater. Over 14,000 were built, and Canada played a strong role in building over 1,451 examples in Fort William, Ontario, Canada.
Having special access to go beyond museum exhibits reveals some of history's best kept secrets and most interesting stories. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of military artifacts on another episode of Militaria at the museum.